All right, good evening. The time is now 6:02 p.m. I would like to call to order the December 9th, 2024 Board Audit Committee meeting. Welcome, everyone. My name is Pamela Boozer-Struther, Vice Chair of this committee and the District 3 representative of the Prince George's County Board of Education. I will be acting chair of the meeting this evening. Tonight, the committee will listen to the Capital Improvement Program overview process. This falls under the Audit Committee responsibility of oversight of risk assessment and risk management and compliance with law and regulations. Agenda item 1.2, roll call. Ms. Barton, please call the roll.
Good evening, everyone. Ms. Pamela Boozer-Struther.
Present.
Mr. Briggs.
Present.
Mrs. Frazier. Mr. Jackson.
Here.
Ms. Lolita Walker. We have 3 present.
Thank you so much, Ms. Barton. We have a quorum present. We will now have introductions of committee members, starting with board members, then administrative staff, board office staff, and any other guests.
I can kick it off. My name is Brandon Jackson, board member, District 6.
Jonathan Briggs, board member for District 2.
Mia Barton, Administrative Secretary for the Board Office.
Good evening, Sharaska Coleman, Chief Operating Officer.
Good evening, Jason Washington, Associate Superintendent of Supporting Services.
And good evening, Shayla Jackson, Director of Capital Programs.
Good evening, Lisa Howell, Chief Financial Officer.
And I see we're also joined by, there she is, Ms. Walter Semple.
Good evening. I'm Janice Walter Semple, the Acting Internal Audit Director.
Thank you, everyone. And I would also like to acknowledge that Board Member Jackson is now Chair Jackson of the Board of Education, and Board Member Briggs is now Vice Chair of the Board of Education, and pleased that they are both serving on the Audit Committee. Agenda item 1.3, Committee Oversight Mission, is as follows. The primary purpose of the Prince George's County Board of Education Audit Committee is to provide oversight of the financial reporting process, the audit process, the PGCPS system of internal controls, and compliance with laws and regulations. Item 1.4, adoption of the December 9th, 2024 Board Audit Committee meeting agenda. The question is to adopt the December 9th, 2024 Board Audit Committee meeting agenda without objection. There being no objection, the December 9th, 2024 Board Audit Committee meeting agenda has been adopted. Item 1.5, approval of November 4th, 2024 meeting minutes. The question is to adopt the November 4th, 2024 Board Audit Committee meeting minutes without objection. There being no objection, the November 4th, 2024 Board Audit Committee meeting minutes have been adopted. Agenda item 2.0, public comment. 2.1, registered public comment. We do not have any registered public comment speakers this evening. Agenda item 3.0, discussion action items. 3.1, the Capital Improvement Program overview process. I recognize Mr. Jason Washington, the Associate Superintendent of Supporting Services, to give us the Capital Improvement Program overview process presentation.
Thanks, everyone. This presentation will be presented by Director Shayla Jackson from the Department of Capital Programs.
Okay, I think that's my cue to go. We're ready? Yes, okay. So thank you for the opportunity today to spend some time examining and discussing a few of the processes behind our capital program at PGCPS. I'm going to jump right in with the note that I'm going to attempt to move pretty quickly through the areas we've recently covered in depth so that there's time for some of the newer bits that I haven't had the privilege of speaking about with the board. And so there's time for any Q&A that might advance our mutual understanding and shared mission around these facilities. Next slide. So the roadmap of our time today, again, we're going to swing by that major project prioritization study we're working through that we call the EFMP or Master Plan Cycle 1. We'll pay a quick visit to the major project prioritization effort we're about to work on next then for Cycle 2 plus. And then we'll spend a little bit more time with the minor project prioritization we haven't discussed in any recent forum and with our general project timelines and related oversight. Next slide. Just prioritizing for improvement. There we go. So this is the bit that hopefully is familiar from our October presentations. The current master plan was prioritized primarily around 3 factors. The first was facility condition. We said that this is what we see, right? The conditions and disrepair that is visible, as well as what's hidden behind the walls. So we covered that this is quantified into a facility condition index or FCI, that is the cost of repair over the value of the building. And the example I always go back to is it's like a house needing a new kitchen sink would have a low condition index because the cost of that sink should be very small compared to the house value. So it's worth it to fix the sink. But our facilities, if you recall, are 3rd worst in the state by condition on average, and that in every district. So they are at such high indices because the needed repairs, which are HVAC, roof, plumbing, windows, doors, ceilings, electrical, all add up to a value that combined is above half the facility value in most cases. So we said then at that point, what's indicated is more of a wrecking ball and less of a renovation. So this index is always a starting player in any master planning to decide where to invest as well as what to invest in. Next slide. So that wasn't very brief, so I'm going to try again here with educational adequacy. So this is the stuff beyond condition that makes a school inequitable and requiring investment. So unsafe parking lot configurations, missing gymnasiums, undersized classrooms by square footage and not by number of students, no STEAM labs. It's also very, very helpful to decide what to do as well as where to do it. So you don't renovate a building with a significantly low EA score, you just knock it down, because what the low EA score is telegraphing is that even were it in perfect condition, this building would still be inadequate for our students. And inadequate is inadequate, whether we can't heat it or we can't teach in it. So this is just another face of failure that's an important pillar for responsible master planning. Next slide. Okay, so utilization. So this is whether underutilization or overutilization. We noted back in October that both contribute to inequitable educational environments and therefore both have serious ramifications to that same question: what do we do and when do we do it? That is educational facility master planning. Underutilization in one school suggests maybe a program location can be evaluated, whereas a persistent underutilization in a region requires consolidations to get students into modernized seats. And that this is because there are real and severe capital funding eligibility penalties when empty seats are present in significant numbers in any region. And that's just baked into that state formula. And then, of course, when a square footage is significantly higher than the enrollment warrants, there's a concept of right sizing that exists universally because there's such significant ramifications to the maintenance budget, the general operations budget, the school-based budgets, and all that translates to different flavors of inadequacy, and that all directly impacts the experience of our scholars to the point that these factors, again, are the star players you'll see driving any responsible master planning or prioritization effort pretty universally. Next slide. Actually, I think I covered that in this one. So one more forward, please. So all these points were then synthesized into our current modernization plan, or EFMP. The highlights were that $8.5 billion in 2014 dollars, and that was $425 million a year of investment that was required again in 2014 dollars. There was 29 consolidations in order to get us into all modernized seats, and it was 140 projects spread out in 3 cycles of approximately 30 to 35 projects each, originally envisioned to be 7 years. And that's how it would be a 20-year master plan. Next slide. So I just want to remind here that what we noted here was that, there's been some legit miracles of innovation and political mountains moved for this cycle 1 to be where it is without that $425 million a year. And really, I should start saying $570 million a year in 2024 dollars. But there's just so much recognition built in around those original numbers that $8.5 billion became such a marketing cry that it gets hard to change it. But nevertheless, even with the P3, even with all of that really collective energy and advocation to move this forward, it's still not enough when you consider the vast amount of facilities we still have in poor condition and the number of decades of underinvestment that represents. Next slide. And this is cycle 2 as it currently is in the current plan. And here I'll just remind that the prioritization factors we've covered and that are represented in cycle 1 will be maintained because they are still solidly best practices. But we do want to get better condition assessment data than the 2008 indices we built our current plan on. We want to update our educational adequacy score template to revisit it against modern standards and then to score our schools against those standards. But we also want to build into this master plan some new pillars, some of the interrelated concepts of equity and sustainability, as well as the blueprint mandates around CTE expansion and universal pre-K. Next slide. And this is just the road step to do that. So in order to revise your EA scores, you have to have new master ed specs. And then we really launch that update project and we start to work through it with community involvement until we're presenting preliminary plannings to the board and the community. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so here's some of the fun new stuff that I didn't have in October. And there's a lot that happens that's not new schools. And I realized reading the board chair's questions for tonight that part of what was being asked was also this, right? What about everything else that's not a new school and how do we prioritize that? So on this first slide, in this category of projects that range from major system upgrades to roof replacements or playground replacements, you see items that come from our maintenance shops. So the 700 shop or the ground shop knows, for example, which parking lots are in such disrepair that they're really becoming problematic for safe pickup and drop off. The 300 shop knows which switchgear or fire alarm is on its last leg, maybe where there's strobes that aren't working. The 900 shop, our HVAC shop, they know where a boiler has truly taken its last stand. So, I would say the wizards and the magicians in these shops are our boots on the ground. And hear me, I can testify that they can squeeze equipment so far beyond the manufacturer's best case for life expectancy in a way that really should generate some shock and awe. So Capital Programs has always placed a great and appropriate weight in their word on what should come next. So even with that said, though, predicting failure is more of an art than a science. So yes, they use data factors, like they know the equipment age and they know the number of work orders that are being performed to keep the systems operable. But it's definitely an area where our building service colleagues who just live with these systems day in and day out are the experts who know where that duct tape and magic has come to an end and capital replacement funding is just truly imperative. Next slide. On this slide, these are a little different because they come from instruction or schools to say, hey, maybe we have a student who needs this accessibility improvement, or maybe we still have an old pod classroom that has survived our efforts to address them all. And the disruption to learning from partial height walls is such that pod conversion is requested, or maybe there's a population shift that warrants a standalone classroom. And I just note here, not additions, because the process for a temporary structure is different in process steps from a permanent addition. And even though right now we are working through some repercussions of our previous approach to temp classrooms being impossible with current permitting requirements, we have to subject like permanent additions to that master planning process. And these two slides are meant to show you how we prioritize projects that are not in the EFMP. They're below the threshold of master planning. But if you recall the October presentation, when square footage is allowed to be added in properly without checks and balances, it can really be used to perpetuate intentionally or unintentionally inequitable investments for decades. So this check and balance process really is fair and reasonable. So we try to include permanent additions within our master planning process. That's a bit of a digression there, but I'll just add that the other items here come from other departments and supporting services, but similarly all pose a threat to the service provision in our schools, whether kitchens might be failing on a code issue and we wouldn't be able to feed kids. Maybe our facility condition has something that's outside our current security guidelines, or maybe it's just an unmet longstanding transportation need that affects our abilities to pick up students. The only other thing I'm going to add on this slide, I'm going to try to do it quickly, is that minor projects get slid into the CIP based on, like I'm telling you, these factors coming up as priorities, but the prioritization once they're in there, that part is a bit tricky. That's a bit of a war, because how do you dictate whose roof goes before whose window goes before whose fire alarm replacement? And that there is no perfect answer there. I will say our general practice has been anything with prior funds is what you'll see at the top of the list. So anything in mid-construction gets first dibs on funding. And after that, it just gets trickier. Because, you know, even to be considered for this list, you're critical. So one of the ways we combat that is in every CIP, we show a list of what we said we were going to do. Like maybe we said we were going to do Valley View's boiler because maintenance said we think this is going to fail. But sometimes if capital funding is delayed, or any part of the process is delayed, the fact that they were predicting failure and it was that critical might mean they had to go ahead and replace that with operating dollars. So we wanted to be transparent when, instead of replacing Valley View's boiler 2 years later, we actually replaced another school's chiller because we were worried that that wouldn't be cooled. So we were trying to introduce an element of oversight that hadn't existed before. So I just wanted to make that note there. Next slide. Capital project timelines. Keep going. So this is gonna be a bit of a moment of truth. Our project management supervisor was gonna cover this for you tonight, but he's recovering from a recent car accident. So you're gonna have to settle for me. And it's been 8 years since I was a project manager in our system. So let's see how this goes. So this is a highly theoretical timeline for a theoretical new elementary school that has theoretically also been already approved for a high prioritization in the EFMP, just so we can get to the place where we're going to talk about the process of that timeline to kick off planning activities and request funding within a CIP. So any step that has that little clock next to it is indicating that there's an approval of an agency outside of PGCPS, and it represents what I'm going to call an external delay potential. So as briefly as I can do this, the first planning and design row, right? Well, the first planning row is that request for initial planning funding. And that takes a year because that's the CIP cycle from request to approval. The next step is the AE firm solicitation. There you go. Sorry, my screen blanked out. I don't know if yours did, but the AE firm solicitation to do early planning activities and or start design tasks takes around 2 months. For a second, when I put this together, I thought this was the only step that didn't require an outside approval, but that's not actually the case. The state now participates in planning and design funds, so there's a contract award approval step right here. So that's just another approval that occurs. The feasibility study, that's more if it's a existing school and we're trying to decide whether to renovate or replace. But if it's a new school on a new site, there's still a test fit study that goes right there. And then that goes to MSDE for approval. After that, you would do the ed specs. You would really get into which programs are going to be there, what the space requirements are for those programs. That goes to MSDE for approval. And then we drop down to the design process. These are pretty easy at each stage, whether it's schematic design, just roughly 30%, design development, roughly 60% done with design, construction drawings, not 90%. All of these go to MSDE and or DGS for approval. There's also a project planning committee, so the community can begin to weigh in on the designs and participate in that process. And then I didn't put this in here, but right around the DD submission, that is where the state would expect to see your construction funding request. So that's another step that's not in here. And of course, if that funding was delayed, well, then the project would incur a delay there. And then once the construction documents are approved by DGS, you would see us enter into the permitting phase. I'm going to put a year. It's a reasonable number, but it's by no means guaranteed to be an upper limit. I think with that, we can go to the next slide. Construction, I think, is pretty straightforward. Assuming this is a design bid build, excuse me, we would put the permitted drawings on the street for about 21 days for a competitive solicitation, which then requires approvals before award. And then the construction phase would launch. But this is to answer Chair Jackson's questions. This really is the most monitored section of the timeline for any project execution. In terms of there being such tight contractual requirements for the builder that is directly tied to their pockets with oversight baked into so many different processes. So for example, the monthly process you pay them is based on progress-based billing. So it's a by line item payment application where the architect of record, the construction manager we've hired, and our project manager must agree on a monthly site walk that, for example, drywall is 37% installed before we will release 32% of the drywall fee. We hold 5% retainage to ensure compliance with any punch list requirements at the end of the project. And then we do that in the progress-based building for every single trade. Another example is weather events, right? They have to be documented with NOAA data. And in fact, they actually have to project out based on NOAA's projections at the time of their bid for what the rainy season and the snow season is going to be like. So those are baked in, and only if we exceed those projections would PGCPS even consider, for example, forking over more money to recover time or accepting a late delivery. Were we to find that unfounded for any reason to be late, we would then assess liquidated damages. That's when those would come into play. So in other words, the contractor would be docked for every day past the agreed upon completion date. So truly, just by itself in this topic, we could do an entire presentation of some of the oversight steps that are really baked into a construction process contractually, and we would be glad to dive into that, preferably with one of our subject matter experts present. So I'm gonna move on and note that post-construction is pretty simple. You know, construction legally ends when a building is done enough to occupy, or for a systems upgrade, it's installed enough to use as intended. So that's what we call substantial completion. And then everything after substantial completion then is in this post-construction phase. So punch list closeout occurs here. That's where we held that last bit of retainage, that 5% for drywall. Well, we'll hold that until we're happy that every single wall meets our standards, and then we'll pay that out. This can drag a bit depending on how well coordinated everything in the end is. Things can happen like a drywall punch list occurring before the furniture move. And you know, then there's definitely some finger pointing, but we try to make sure every process benefits PGCPS, right? Commissioning is the next step. That can be surprising because it can drag on for at least a year, and that by design. So, for example, HVAC systems must be commissioned, but they must do so in their proper season. So if we turn it over in summer, we still have to go through a whole cycle of seasons. Landscaping at this theoretical new elementary school, well, it has to have site stabilization, which means that landscaping shrubbery and grass has to grow roots. Otherwise, we're still a stormwater runoff threat, and we can't finalize that project. And that list really does just go on. And it's actually longer now because a lot of the green and net zero projects, now you have to have a step of extended commissioning where you determine over a year that you're truly operating in a net zero or a net positive state. So there's all sorts of documentations and approvals required in that commissioning step, just so you can move into the closeout phase and for the warranty phase to start. What else can I tell you there? I think that's about it. I think that brings us basically to the end of the presentation, and we can just answer questions or provide responses when the rest of the team is available, depending on how detailed the questions might be.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you so much, Director Jackson. So now I will open the floor to my colleagues to ask questions. And then when they're finished with round one, I will ask Board Member Vice Chair Briggs to take the floor while I ask mine. Thanks. Any questions, colleagues? Okay, Vice Chair Briggs?
Great. Thank you so much, Acting Chair Boozer Struther. So I just had a question for Ms. Taylor Jackson during the planning phase of the presentation, specifically for the ed specifications. My question was, how closely does the developer or whomever work with school leaders for that specific phase or during the design phase? And I asked this question because I actually spoke with a principal who was like, I love the school, it's great, we love it, but if I had it my way, like we would probably have less of like a kind of a community space because we need more classrooms, and so we didn't have the space for that. And we would have like maybe moved something else around. So it was like she brought up really kind of, when you're building your house and you know how you want it, like really specific nuances that she in hindsight realized didn't really work. So I was just curious how closely that happens, if at all.
Absolutely, it's a great question. So the ed spec process is, John, like that committee requirement is very fascinating. Like it has all of our leading like academic leaders, and I'm not going to get their titles right. If it's a CTE space, it has the head of CTE. If it's special education, they're there. If it's like, I mean, down to if it's a cosmetology space, the teachers are there. So the ed spec process is really involved. So we also have the prototype ed spec. So since this was an elementary school in my theory, so that's a little harder because that's kind of general, but you have this baseline, which is really helpful because it helps us ensure equity. So I do like having a prototype, but then when you're in a specific school, building school-specific ed specs, you're looking at what programs that school has. Maybe that school's actually a regional tag center and it needs special spaces. So we work through that with the school-based staff. We work through it with the academic staff. And then that goes to, well, actually goes to the board for vote, and it goes to MSDE. And then the design actually really has to follow that ed spec. Like you can vary like 10%. If it says a classroom is 900 square feet, you can go from 810 to 970, but like, that's not right. Don't quote me on the math, but that's the general idea. And then you really have to have a valid reason for varying from your ed spec. And then at that point, the design has a project planning committee. Again, there's teachers, there's the principal, there's those same leaders, there's the community. And we're trying to show them the concepts as it's coming out. We're showing them the floor plans as it's coming out. But for that specific issue, I think sometimes there's a confusion about how that process works. So we know from the ed specs how many classrooms you're going to have. And we're going to build those classrooms regardless of whether or not you have a community space. The community space is a different requirement. I forgot where it originates, but you'll see it in almost all our buildings. A lot of times we haven't gotten the MOU and the contracts in place for them to be ready to go when the schools open. But I know some of our schools that we just opened, Some of those were envisioned to be community health clinics. So that's why you see that community space is like on the front, so you can have their own egress point in and out. But there was never a calculation where it was like, well, if you don't have this space, you would have more classrooms, because the classrooms was built on the design to capacity. And that's where all of those support spaces came out. I will say we have a lot of principal turnover, so it's not always the principal who is in the design process who then inherits the building. And I know that sometimes that's part of a bit of a conflict, because now you own a building, you didn't get to participate in its design.
And Director Jackson, as a part of this question, can you also speak to, once the building has been constructed, some of the follow-up feedback you get from users as to how it may impact future designs?
Yeah, that's something we're real excited about, because we haven't formalized that. We haven't had internal design and planners who, I just wanted it to be a really documented process. But what we do is we do an end user survey, because a lot of times our architects are very innovative and they have these grand ideas that are being deployed across the nation and sometimes internationally, like teaching stairs, like the ones at Ochoa, or breakout spaces in the hall, and they've got these visions for how the school is going to use it and how the children are going to benefit. And sometimes when you go to the schools, they're like, yeah, that's really just a nightmare. Like, it's a nightmare. Like, they're in the hall. It's not a good breakout space. And so we try to take that back, so that in our next design, we either 86 that, or maybe we build upon it, or we fix it. Because that's such a good opportunity to find out. Like, we want to innovate, but we only want to do it in a way that furthers and advances the educational experience of our students in those spaces.
I feel like my time is up, but Acting Chair Boozer, let me know if that's the case.
Yeah, I guess I've suspended time. I didn't ask for a clock to be set for everyone, so I understand that answers to these questions are not going to, we already understand that if you want the full answer right now, that we will have more than the 2.5 minutes. So if you agree with that, we could keep going.
Well, I just had one last thing. I don't want to actually hog up a lot of air times, but I just wanted to say, like, so I wanted to just understand better with the architect and then the developer. What's the distinction? Do they come paired? Are we like going contracting with an architect and then the developer is really doing all of the kind of the planning there? And the reason why I asked that question is because I still think it's really important, to the point that you made, that the design fits, like I just think about like that, if the principal is there for some time and the teachers, that there is that buy-in to the space. And if, as we're going forward, if there's some way to kind of make that more efficient or just more effective, maybe in how we're planning.
I'm sorry, what was the question part?
So is the architect
Oh,
the developer?
that's what I need. I'm right. Yeah. So we don't have developers per se on the traditional projects like they did on the P3 projects. What we do is hire an architect who does our planning. So they'll do like our ed specs. And usually that's the architect that actually then designs the building. At that point, we bring on who's going to be our builder. For us, that's either a general contractor or a construction manager at risk. And then they just build what's in the design. So where we spend a lot of time getting our principal and our teachers' input is in the ed specs, which is what programs will be in your school, how many square feet they'll have, what kind of furnishings they'll have. And then in the design process, which we know in the early design process how the floor plan is going to work out. We know where your core classrooms are going to be, where your special classrooms are going to be, and we know where that community space is going to be. There might be also some tension because the community space requirement is sort of like it's not really a requirement, but the state contributes to a community space. And we tend to always try to maximize our state input. So if they're going to pay for a space, even if we're not 100% sure if it's going to be in like before or after care, if it's going to be a community health space, we're probably going to take that money and build that space out. But I just think there's some misunderstanding in that situation with that principal, because that space wasn't taken from another space she could have had. She was always going to get the program spaces in the ed spec, and that's what's in the design.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Board Chair Jackson?
Thank you. Appreciate that. So this question is about the maintenance piece. Can you help walk me through, and I know you kind of covered it a little bit, but walk me through how do we prioritize maintenance, like which I get things like whether it's like a boiler room or like heat or windows, like how do we prioritize what school gets the maintenance piece first, like, you know, as far as their problems addressed based on severity, like how do we calculate that?
Okay, so I'm gonna do the HVAC, right? Because that's one shop. That's the 900 shop. And those was, I'm sorry, I thought I heard something. Okay. That's the 900 shop. So they provide the capital programs a list of what they consider their most imminent failures, places where they can't patchwork anymore, where they need a system replacement. That might just be the boiler. It tends to be from the HVAC shop, you know, just the specific piece of equipment that's about to fail. And we don't really question their prioritization. So if there is any opportunity to put it in the capital budget, you'll see it. You'll see it in AC upgrades. This year, because there was a indication from the state that there's going to be additional funding available beyond our major projects, we changed our normal process with the state and we put a lot of systemics before the state. And those came from either the shops for the roofs, they came out of the roof inspections. Those were the ones where we were having the most water infiltration and the most mold issues. And there's just nothing more our hazardous material guys can do. And there's just nothing more that patching can do for those roofs. So when they tell us that these are the worst ones that they're worried about, we really do just put an extraordinary amount of trust in their knowledge for living with those facilities like that.
Definitely, rightfully so. I would just say, so when it comes to like, let's say you have like like you said, like the 900 shop or the 700 shop, like, so when you have like different shops saying these are our priorities, which priority becomes the, I guess, the most imminent or like, you know, priority, like the top priority, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good question. So that part does not have a satisfactory answer because we just don't have one, right? We don't know how to prioritize one person's boiler or another fire alarm system that might fail. So you'll see that the capital budget is going to request all of it. It's going to request the fire alarm replacements. It's going to put the boiler in the AC upgrades category. The only thing I'm mentioning we did different this year was we shoved some to the state because we're always looking for available funding. So they have a healthy schools fund. We threw some roofs on there because really we should be replacing 15 roofs a year, but that's $37 million that we don't have. But so unfortunately though, of course, that means once it is approved by the board, it then goes through like the county process. And right now, you know, their main concerns are about their debt ceiling and affordability. So it doesn't always feel good to us. Like, yes, the requests are there, but we think the likelihood of them funding AC upgrades, which got $0 last year, is probably low this year. But yes, the Board of Education requested the funding. I'm just less confident that will get it. And I will say the prioritization of those projects isn't as clear in our CIP presentation as our major projects. Because if you notice, our major projects are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but then there's a whole category called AC upgrades, and it's not in that priority order. There's another project, fire alarm replacements. There's a project, hazardous material abatement, ADA upgrades. And we don't, as a system, present those as do this ADA upgrade and then do this fire alarm and then do this boiler. We just ask for the whole money for those categories.
I think Dr. Coleman, did you want to chime in? I didn't mean to cut you off. I thought you came off mute.
I did. Thank you so much, Board Chair. I was only going to add that in addition to just the history that our maintenance teams have with our facilities, they also utilize our work order system to help develop that priority order. So they're basing it on true data that is tracked on a consistent basis.
Gotcha. Thanks. Thank you. And then the last question I have for this round is about if it's okay to proceed, Pim. Okay, the last question I have is about the CIP or like the backlog or whatever, right? So it's like how much how much will it take to clear out the backlog of like the CIP projects? Like how much money would it take to bring us up to speed completely?
I have to define backlog. We've defined it a couple ways. There's a backlog of funding that looks like it's on the books that we haven't spent. Some of that is allocated to specific projects. We're waiting to get to a certain point where they can spend. Others is old funds that has strings attached to it that our team has just been this year really trying to cut through that to make it available for us to spend. Another definition of backlog, though, is like our deferred maintenance backlog, and that's the list of needs that we have. So that is where, when we talk about that $8.5 billion, $5.5 billion of that is considered the deferred maintenance backlog. And I mean, that's the short answer, but that $5.5 billion was in 2014 dollars. And that's what that would take.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, it's not a satisfactory answer.
I'm going to hand the meeting over to
Okay, I was like, I think she's looking
Briggs.
at recognize board member Boozer Struther.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate the presentation and your framework in moving with us as we sit as the board audit committee and as we move towards the language of risk assessment and risk management and internal controls. And I appreciate the preview around internal controls because I believe this committee will be asking the team to come back and do exactly as you had suggested with the internal experts on that financial and operational internal controls. When we look at CIP from the vantage point of the board and this committee, it is one of the areas of risk that is very visible. Some of our risk, like around safety and security and cyber security, would be more difficult to present, because for safety concerns. So I appreciate your working with us to reach this point that we're speaking this language of internal audit as a board. And, and so when I look at these risks, it's the decades of underfunding, which has been presented, in multiple avenues to the board that we understand, but we haven't really been telling our funders, the Maryland General Assembly and the County Council, we haven't really been presenting, I think, as much in this risk, speaking about it as risk. And so I was wondering if you could talk through just a little more again about some of those real risks. Like when I think about the risk of, a review of a building and that that it is deemed structurally not safe, as we were surprised with Templeton and Woodmore, what happens? Like at this point, do we have any more swing space? How would the students be educated? I was watching closely today the issue of Colin Powell had to close because of a major pipe burst, and there's space in 2 schools to move those students temporarily. But what about the risk of a full closure? Like what kind of pressure has that put on your division? And so I'll just have you expand a little more about what this means right now to this board.
Yeah, it's a good question because, our swing space is so severely limited that we don't have a lot of backup plans in terms of where can you relocate an entire school without breaking it up and disrupting the educational experience and straining transportation as well. I do want to note that we feel confident that there aren't any structural like life safety structural issues that would cause us to close in the next couple of days. It's couple years. That's why the assessments were done for the structures. But we worry about that in part because as we talk about things like roof replacements, that continued water infiltration and those window replacements, water infiltration, it destroys your structural integrity over time, in addition to making it a sick building. And so some of the areas of risk are keeping the buildings healthy enough to be occupied despite that much water being infiltrating, Heating and cooling, I think, is our biggest risk. Like, I think I could see us, when an HVAC system gets not just beyond its useful life, but like our maintenance team just can't do anything else. It has to be replaced. We've rented boilers and we've rented chillers. It's pretty expensive to the operating budget, but that's how we've kept schools open. We've definitely, I think, gone through great lengths, but it just feels like, there's a breaking point where if you don't modernize, those risks aren't so much risks. They're just eventually going to be our reality. And what's scary to me is since you can't, do you remember when I think did we close Forest Heights for a structural issue? I think you were in then. So there was nowhere for them to go. So you had to shove them into already filled schools, already over capacity schools. You're teaching in stairwells. And that is a risk too, right? Because we don't have the swing space. We just got in a little operations very friendly argument about um Forestville because we value Forestville and Meadowbrook so much because we are constantly trying to swing everybody into our two available, and sizable swing space options. One of the things we want to do with the next master plan is not just have this is how we're going to improve the buildings, but where are we swinging? So how do we build in a swing plan? Because that definitely slows down our modernization ability, and not just the new schools. James Madison really, really needed that systems upgrade and that limited renovation, but they needed a place to swing. And so we are trying to work on having a swing space plan too. Hopefully it is to improve schools and not to just house because of failures, right? That would be heartbreaking.
Yeah, I appreciate the response and the more depth to this discussion that I think as we as we begin to pull this all together as a risk assessment, this is very helpful to head in this direction. So I will now go to round two. I will now resume chairing the meeting, and I saw Board Chair Jackson had his hand up. Are you ready for round two?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chair Boozer Struthers. So, my question was, well, before I think I think Chief Howe had her hand up.
Oh, my
Okay.
apologies, Chief Howe.
Okay. You're good, Chief Howe?
No, my hand was up. I see
Okay.
Mr. Board Member Briggs, his hand is up, but not mine.
Okay, cool. So I wanted to talk about oh yeah, risk. We were talking about risk in regards to how we prioritize. So it's like I don't know if this is a Mr. Washington question, like a legal question or not, but just if we're just doing like a SWOT analysis, and even I don't know if Miss Walter Simple, if you looked at this either from an internal audit standpoint, just about like how susceptible are we to like lawsuits and stuff like that for like having our buildings in certain positions, like for example like I know like some of our buildings, like for example like Sasser for example has like it has brown water coming out of the faucet, and I think there's a degree of mold in the building, right? So not saying that it'll happen, but how susceptible, like it could happen where, employees can potentially sue PGCPS to get sick. I don't know. Do we take that into an account when we're like formulating our risk and how we move and prioritize things? 'Cause I didn't really hear us talk about like hedging risk as far as like what leaves us vulnerable to like lawsuits and things of that nature. So I just wanted to, I don't know who that I can pitch that question to, but I would like some feedback on that.
I'd like to start and then somebody can provide some of the holes because I think, what you're onto is something that has happened. I do want to say the pillars that we build our master plan on are really unassailable in the sense that these are just such generally accepted master planning strategies. Like Prince George's County isn't doing anything out of pocket there. Those are the things that you must consider in any system universally to come up with a prioritization order. But I don't think the the risk from our perspective comes from the prioritization order. It comes from that speed with which we're doing it, or despite all the innovation, the lack of sufficient speed. Because yes, we have scholars in schools that we wouldn't want them to be. Then we have staff in schools with conditions we wouldn't want them to be in. And we know that there's precedent. I don't know if you guys remember, DC definitely was sued for violation of civil rights based on what they were providing for public education facilities. So I just want to say I understand where you're coming from. And I think it's a really good and responsible train of thought to evaluate.
Thank you. Ms. Walters Semple, did you want to, I see you come up?
Yeah, I was just gonna make a little contribution here regarding the risks. And so when we perform our biannual risk assessment, these are some of the factors that I guess we can build into, since this is, you know, a topic that has been raised here. We can factor this aspect of it into our risk assessment. I know generally we look at the operational controls and more financial controls when we conduct those risk assessments. But from this standpoint, we can incorporate these risks because I guess legal risk is significant. It can have significant financial impact on the board and Prince George's County Public Schools as a whole. So I think this is one thing or one aspect that will take back to our, I will take back to our investigative auditor who performs our biannual risk assessment so that we can ask the relevant questions and evaluate how or what impacts they will have. And in order for us to gather that information, we'll have to, you know, ask the relevant questions of the personnel in leadership positions, and then hopefully we can get the appropriate response, and we can have that documented and report it back to you.
Thank you so much. Because I mean, I see, you know, board members' responsibility, you know, and this is what I envision is like protectors of the enterprise as a whole, you know. And I'm just thinking about opportunities or that people and I'm not saying like nefariously, but I mean like where people can get sick or get hurt, or I know you say like from a structural standpoint we're pretty sound, right? But like these little things like mold or, you know, brown water, or like these things can lead to, you know, many lawsuits that can even put us further behind the ball in certain areas. And financially, I think these things will all turn, you know, to financial, you know, ramifications at some point. So I wanted to know is how are we like considering those risks while we're prioritizing, but it seems like there is a, from my understanding, Dr. Jason, seems like there is a like a generally accepted way of, you know, you develop your prioritization. This may not be included a part of it is what I'm getting, but could it be? Because I don't know if like the legal risk are a part of the prioritization piece. I guess that's where I'm getting at. So I don't know if they kind of live together, or internal audit is saying that they can look into it to see, you know, how we can address the risk. But I don't know if you guys are already doing that per se.
I would say only in the sense that all of those factors represent a risk for like those lawsuits. So, you know, when you look at the ones that have happened around facilities and other systems, it was things like severe overcrowding, because that gave you a inferior educational experience. Buildings that were in the condition issues that would make you have a low facility condition index. Those are the stuff where you'll see mold and inadequate air quality and inadequate daylighting in a sick building. And that's that same thing you're saying, like, yeah, that is a risk. So some of that I think really truly is already baked in, and we can certainly like explode each of those areas and look at what that exactly means. But yeah. we don't call it that. We just focus on the risk to education, but I don't think it's wildly different.
Thank you. So I think Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you. Vice Chair of the Board, Burt.
Thank you so much, Acting Chair Boozer Struther. I'm just going to keep saying it because, why not? So my question is for Ms. Taylor Jackson, and I did want to go backwards at some point, just back to the initial question so I can get clarity. But the question was for that second piece, and this is around the post-construction phase. And so I just wrote down, are there costs that build up in the post-construction phase that could be more efficient in the updated educational facility master plan? I know you talked about like sometimes that can take the longest where you're trying to get all of these kind of final pieces at the end after the construction's over. Obviously it wouldn't be the longest, the construction would be the longest, but I imagine that there might be costs that are associated with that. Is that tracked? And if so, could we have something in there around efficiency to cut costs as we're now having all these discussions about limited dollars in the potential future?
Trying to come up with an example of us incurring costs in the post-construction phase, and I haven't been able to do it. I will say, like with projects like Fairmount Heights High School, which is still in its post-construction phase, there is a litigation type risk and liabilities when there are multiple faults involved between a designer and a contractor. And as a school system, it can be very hard because sometimes we take a stance, okay, we don't want to settle because we don't want to make a precedent that PGCPS settles, but then it does it drags out, right? And now we're not paying the contractor, we're not necessarily seeking because we feel like maybe there's shared fault. And it could be a whole mediation litigation exercise. So when things go wrong, I think that's a different type of risk that we could discuss when it comes to when legal action occurs. On our standard projects. No, because what I was talking about with the commissioning and stuff, that's built into the process. So everyone is expecting it to take that amount of time. It's just when there's defects and the contractor's like, I built it according to the engineer's specification. And then the engineer is like, nah, I don't think you did, but and there's this argument and it's in a gray area. There's some liability to our system. So you could see, if you went back on our projects for the last 10 years, you could see that we've constantly refined our contracts to try to protect the system increasingly and more and more. And I feel like there's always, we talked about lessons learned from how did the school like the building, but one of the lessons learned from our project management team is, where did you feel like you didn't have enough teeth in your contract to fight for the system and its interests? So that's one of the ones that's constantly ongoing that I know our project management team would be delighted to talk more about.
And then I think I just want to make this comment, and I'm not sure if Dr. Coleman wants to share anything, but I just wanted to make this comment because I hear this from my colleagues, and I feel like this is also what I hear from the community side of it, which is I feel like there's this perception that like once the educational facility master plan is like, ratified, and obviously there are updates that can happen throughout, but like it's locked in. It's like the train is moving, it's left the station, like, we've taken into consideration all these different things, nothing's changing, it's static. And so wherever your school was in that lineup is probably where it's going to be unless there's really some like significant, reason as to why you changed that. And I just wonder if like that's a piece, a component I know you talked about during our board meeting a while ago, like some of those things are going to be shifting because it was about overutilization in the classroom space. And so now we're talking about deferred maintenance. But I was just curious about that their perception that exists around the EFMP and if that's going to be included in the new version of it.
Absolutely. So that perspective is spot on. Like, it's not just a perception. That's the definition of an educational facilities master plan. You go through these hard studies and these hard choices, and you tell the community these are our priorities, and you kind of fight it out as a system, and then you dig in your heels and you stick to it. And the part where you said, unless there's something that is something we can really point to, tangible, to move those priorities. I think that's responsible. That's how it should be. But we should do that, right? We should update. We should say like Whitmore, right? We had a structural issue. It got elevated into cycle 1. That's responsible too, because those plans are made at such a high level that sometimes as you're marching out, even through 10 years, some things do need to be considered differently. Maybe you were called for an addition, but population shifts and trends and you no longer need that addition. Should we still build the addition? Of course not. We should still think and we should still be strategic. What we're doing now is not kind of trashing the old master plan. We're just updating it. We're looking at, it was done 10 years ago now. So there are some places, especially around cycle 2 and cycle 3, where we should look at, and mind you, cycle 2 and cycle 3 weren't prioritized. So they're just a big data dump for cycle 2. I'm sorry, it's late there. You might see kids soon. But cycle 2 and cycle 3 weren't prioritized. And I think cycle 2 is like 37 schools. So like even that by itself, it needs to be subject to a rigid prioritization process now. And some of those cycle 3 schools just have a TBD on them. They weren't even really, nobody was saying they could make it to cycle 3. They were saying they need to be consolidated into a new building. So we really want to look at that. And I think if we do a really, really good job together between us and the Board of Education and the community, and we all have some buy-in, even if we're not 100% satisfied and we wish a couple more of our schools were there, but if we feel like it's fair and equitable, yeah, I hope we dig in our heels and we just march down that list, because that is part of how money comes when people see that Prince George's County isn't whimsical, but dedicated and marching down a really firmly established in data and equity and need priority list. So I do hope we achieve that again.
Yeah,
Dr. Coleman?
and that's very well said, Director Jackson, because otherwise, Board Member Briggs, we run the risk of it not being about the data, but instead being about which community is the loudest, right? And so part of the success that we've been able to achieve through cycle 1 has been staying focused on those same priorities in order to stay on track to meet the goals that we've set to meet.
Oh, and I hope I'm not out of order. I just want to add that once you start changing your priorities and you submit it to the state decides Prince George's County doesn't know what they want, and that money now goes to Calvert or goes to Queen Anne, and we just really don't want that.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I just want to say yes. Thank you so much, Ms. Taylor Jackson and Dr. Coleman, for the explanation, because that makes complete sense, right? That's how, again, to your point, like that's what we should do. And I feel like your office is always walking the tightrope of having to navigate the political nuance of like what the community's perception and then what we have to do, right? The work, the task that you all were given to do, some mandated by law. But I just know that that's a piece that like a lot of times is, the narratives matter, right? Because if just blast to the past last year, we had all of these elected officials battling over $10 million more for this program in the South because the South County doesn't get funding. And then that presents a public perception of like, well, is construction not going to get done? Like, why are we doing this? And it's like, why are things so static? Did you all get it wrong? And so those are the parts where it's like, when we're boots on the ground, we got to explain like, well, they really took that into consideration back in 2014. That was 10 years ago, right? Like none of that to them is, so it's like, I just think with the educational facility master plan, like that's still a nuance that exists, right? Where even if we are marching forward and it's probably probability wise, like very effective plan, it's going to be successful. There's that human aspect of it. So I just wanted to throw that in there, whatever way that can be kind of mitigated.
Yeah, and you're right. And because part of that tension that we start to feel becomes because of the pace. That's what Director Jackson was talking about, right? So we can be on the right track, but if we're not getting to my community for another 15 years, then that becomes problematic. And I need you to look at your priorities again. So that's part of why the ACF is so important, is that coupled with our major renovations, coupled with our traditional capital programs plan, is accelerating our ability to modernize our facilities on 3 different tracks.
Mr. Briggs, could you chair the meeting now?
So sorry. Board Member Boozer-Strother.
Thanks. So I want to thank my colleagues for looking at legal risk, and I think it's not just our Board of Education that would be, I think at this legal risk, it would be, I mean, the state would have to seriously consider what, where we're like that this is becoming so untenable. And I look to, the Bradford case out of Baltimore, which came to what I find is an unacceptable end by the appellate court. But Bradford went after the funding of inequitable funding of, the city of Baltimore schools, and it's credited with bringing about the blueprint for Maryland's future legislation as a response by the legislature, because this lawsuit is pretty significant, and this lawsuit is suggesting that school construction is a state that the state is by law to fund public education in Maryland. So it's not just our legal risk. And I think, we could also be saying we may be the legal risk to the state as we face as a board this untenable situation where we may have our employees and families attempt to use the courts on us. So I think this is that all in it together moment that our all elected bodies and county council should recognize that this is not continuing to underfund school construction is their legal risk as well. So I think, we definitely have to raise this issue. The one question I do have is around the move towards sustainability and resiliency in our construction program, and if we are able to measure the risk of, say, the new Ellen Ochoa Middle School as a building built within some of the frameworks of resiliency, that building could withstand a severe weather event more than, say, Nicholas Orem Middle School, a much older school. Like, are we able to positively measure the risk from that vantage point as well? Or is that for future discussion?
Is that for me? I don't know. That is such a good
I'm looking at
question.
anyone who might be who has the. I mean, if this is for future discussion, I'm fine with that too.
We are talking about it though. I definitely would say with that group, and maybe that's what Jason came off to do. It's one of the things we're talking about is where are we putting those investments, and that's why I feel like those are specifically interrelated. Our director of sustainability always talks about how sustainability is always meant to have been equitable, and so she's very interested in where we can invest to address that very thing. But that's fascinating. Jason, what are you going to say?
Yeah, I was gonna say it's too early. Just from a standpoint of as Director Jackson has said, is going through a full year seasons, one, and then and how the building adapts to to live conditions versus planned conditions. But that's not stopping us from implementing these design choices as we go forward. So this is the framework that we will utilize going forward, and we will continue to refine it as we move forward.
Great, thank you. That's my final question. It looks like we have an appetite for a third round. If there are no objections to a third round, we'll move forward. Seeing no objections, Chair of the Board Jackson.
Thank you. This will be my last question for tonight. So my question comes to our community partnerships in general, and I asked this question back in October, and I just wanted to, follow up on this. Is there any like organized effort to get the private sector or even the public sector companies that are located in our footprint, or even have employees in our footprint, whether it be in local, neighboring jurisdictions, to help with some of the shortcomings from a financial standpoint, or like, helping with different parts of buildings that may need help, or structural issues, or anything they can do, like from a financial contribution. Like, are we like targeting companies to help us with these efforts? Because it seems like we have a bit of a shortfall, and so I just wanted to know, is there any organized effort around that?
I will say the only effort like that I've seen is a push for them to get business with us, which is, very, very much paid work, not volunteer work. I do know I've seen community partnerships, but they seem to be limited to maybe like a playground replacement. I definitely haven't seen like anyone come in and help us like heat or cool our buildings. Dr. Coleman, Jason, have you seen something different there?
I haven't, but what I would say is that, we are trying to augment the available funding through grant dollars. And we have been very, very strategic about looking at any potential grant opportunities to help support the gap that we know we have in our deferred maintenance, our renovations of our schools.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dr. Coleman. It's just to me, it's just puzzling, like how, like, for example, like the Redskins, well, the Commanders are, a few 100 feet away from Golson and Cole Rice, um, and who could use, significant upgrades in different spaces of the building. And I'm just thinking, like, how we aren't leveraging those relationships. All I know, and even speaking with the administration on staff, is like, and I'm not even going to call out any. I didn't even mean to say the rest of it. Call out any business particularly, but it's just like how we're so vested into these different groups, private or public sector, and they're not pouring or paying that corporate social responsibility. And I just don't know if it's something that we just don't know. They could be doing it behind the scenes, or they're not just doing it at all. And so I think when it comes to a community, um, there's give and take, and there's partnerships that should be forged. And I'm just trying to figure out how we can leverage it, whether it's through grant opportunities, or philanthropic efforts, or even volunteerism, like just to figure out how to bridge that gap. So that's just the reason why I asked that question.
For some reason, you saying the Commanders triggered something, but I will say they have committed. They do have grant funding, and they are only specifically interested in stadiums and the turf fields, and they have spent. I don't have a dollar amount, but they have invested in different turf fields over the last decade or so. But it has been very, specific to that, I will say.
Okay.
Mr. Washington?
Yeah, I was going to say a couple of comments on that. One, at one time, the Redskins / Commanders, they provided at the school system's insistence washing machines for students that did not have washing machines at home. And so there were washing machines installed at Walker Mill and at Kenmore. And so very discreet ask. But a lot of times these corporate partnerships are tied to their specific request. They'll come to us and say, we're willing to fund this, or because it's in our mission or in our objective. So with the Commanders, it would be fields. It would be, and so that's the only thing I would point out, is that a lot of it is tied to their specific objectives of how they want to invest in the community. Not to say that we should not, and I believe that the Education Foundation for Prince George's County, I think Thea does a great job of shaking trees to see not just money, but in terms of in-kind opportunities and donations as well. But definitely more can be done. But I think that's what we have to plug into, is that a lot of this is tied to discrete foundational or philanthropic like organizational objectives that they have. But I do know specifically, because we had that issue with the washing machines, for instance, at those schools when we built the P3, that's what I was told at the time, is that a direct request was made and they provided a multiple number of washing machines for those families that did not have access to them at school or in their homes, rather.
Thank you.
Does that conclude your round? Okay. Mr. Briggs, you'll have the last question, it looks like.
Okay, great. I just wanted to go back to the initial piece, and you answered it, Ms. Taylor Jackson, Dr. Jackson, but I just want to say, I want to put it out there that with the architect and the design plan and the layout, and just, it made me think about fun fact. I was actually watching this documentary about the World Trade Center and the redevelopment of it, and how they had like all of these architects kind of bid and their designs and things like that. And it was a lovely idea because they wanted everyone bought into what would be the future of like what that space looked like. And I feel like, as we're going into this next cycle and cycles of the construction and also the redevelopment of the education facility master plan, like it would be really nice to have that as a consideration too, is like, who are the right architects? And is there some way to get, just educators' perspectives on like whatever those general layouts are? It sounds like you were saying there are different plans that they have, floor layouts or things like that, that you can pick from. And so just something that like I think gets more, not to say that there's not buy-in, but that if there is some way to be more effective with what the floor plans look like and who the architect is, I would love that to be a consideration.
I will say, I think that is what the P3 did, right? You guys had the bid process include some concepts. We have had a hard time doing that from the traditional program, I will note, because we weren't offering quite the lucrative potential package. So some of our smaller, especially our minority businesses and county-based businesses were like, look, we can only put so much design time on a solicitation that's not guaranteed, but we want to do something at a smaller scale, like just concepts, even with just Crosslands edition, right? Because we want to encourage somebody who's really excited about the project and is going to do something unique. So we are trying to figure out how to do that. And I hear what you're saying, because even though sometimes our educators are in the room, I think they definitely get the ed specs, because it's, what do you need to operate this nurse's suite? And it's, well, I need this many beds and I need this equipment and I need the door to be this wide to fit this type of wheelchair. Like, I think that part communicates well, but I will say sometimes having them look at a flat floor plan, like for schematic design, I think they can see that and still be surprised by the building that is built from that. So, we don't quite have the ability to use some of the private industry ways. Like we can't do the virtual reality where you can walk through, because that actually costs more in your design fees, and it's great for law firms, but it's hard for school systems. But there are some ways we can try to improve so they understand what they're looking at, so they're not surprised on opening day when they've truly been involved in every step of the process.
And the other piece I would just add to that is I'm also excited that Director Jackson is excited about the end user surveys, because we've opened a number of buildings now. And so we have users who are in these schools using them, and they can give us real-time feedback around what worked well, where are the pain points, and we're applying that learning to this next tranche of schools that's going to be coming online.
Great, thank you, Dr. Coleman. So I just want to thank the entire team for the presentation and for the Q&A. The next agenda item is 4.0, follow-up and next steps. So any follow-up questions specific to this meeting that were captured or can be added by board members to our system of communicating with administration, please do so, and we will align those to come back. 5.0, closing remarks from the committee vice chair and adjournment. So again, thank you to everyone for a great meeting. The question is to adjourn the December 9th, 2024 Board Audit Committee without objection. There being no objections, the December 9th, 2024 Board Audit Committee meeting has been adjourned. Have a great evening, everyone. Good night.